why I bring up that, following up with your question, is for me, Stravinsky is one of the few guys you'd probably ever question and go, you know, I don't think that should be a thumb roll, that should be a shake roll, or that should be this and that. I mean, he's one of the guys you know he thought about what he was doing a lot with percussion. But basically, I have one of those thumbs that just doesn't have a great pad on it, doesn't really work well for thumb rolls. So I've always kind of had to use my finger rolls for everything. If you've experimented with this and practiced this in the practice room or on a rehearsal, trying to do that and then having like a really loud release with your heel, it's just sort of an awkward negotiation. I've never been able to make that work very well. So it was actually preparing for that rehearsal. I was like, God, I gotta do this. I know he's gonna want to see this. And he's like, yeah, it looks really good, but your release is coming late. It's just not quite jiving. And I'm like, how am I gonna do this? And sort of on the fly, because again, he didn't want to hear excuses. He just wanted it to sound the way he wanted it. And I was like, all right, so I sort of grabbed a chair real quick and then said, let's try. And the first time I ever did it, I just tried releasing it on my leg. So you find, I think you get a pretty good pop. And if you kind of treat each of those rolls as sort of a crescendo into the release, you get a pretty good. It's not quite the same as that, but it's a similar effect. So a case of where I'm sort of ignoring what Stravinsky said a little bit, but ultimately you're sounding and the part is fitting in the way it should. So when I have enough moisture. Sorry about that. Okay, tambourine questions up to that point. Anything else you may have seen in Carnival as well? Yes?
Sorry, I'm going to be so full of questions.
No, that's great. That's great. Hopefully you will feel inclined as well, but that's fine. Well, that's great. Please, ask away.
So do you use beeswax or any kind of sandpaper-esque things for that excerpt?
I use beeswax, which is when I said I was looking for moisture, that's actually what I was looking for, but I think it's in a bag over there somewhere, so I just went for some spit. Yeah, I use a little bit. I mean, you see, there's some pretty extreme examples of people that, like, I mean, it was like a decade or a couple of decades there where guys were like glazing their tambourine heads and putting like sugar crystals on there. And fine, if it works for you, it works. I never cared, as long as it doesn't mess up the sound of the tambourine. Mm-hmm. To me, it's just a reasonable amount of beeswax, and then for me, a certain amount of moisture. Some guys don't ever have to do anything. I mean, they can do that friction roll on any surface. Keith can certainly tell you about that, having just come from CCM, because Al Lottie there is like, he's doing it on everything.
It's nonsense.
It's nonstop. Yeah, that's right. That's right. So yeah, for me, but honestly, it'll depend on your individual tambourine. What kind of tambourine do you use?
I use a Grover.
Okay, that can be fine. I mean, that can work certainly fine. I don't like to mess with the head too much, to the point where, I mean, I've seen people like put moleskin and just having all kinds of things, and it's a point where it muffles it so much that it's so dry that it has very limited uses. It's kind of like, you know, when you play a snare drum and you're in the practice room and you're hearing it right next to you, you're like, dry, you know, you always want it crispy, 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 and then the reality is in the ensemble when you're playing it, a lot of that resonance, like that ping that you a lot of times want to get rid of, that little overtone in your snare drum, that it drives me crazy too, that stuff doesn't carry when you're playing behind an 80 to 85 piece orchestra in a 1,000-seat hall, you know? Even though it's like, God, I hate that, but then there's a point where you take away so much resonance that it just loses its sound. It doesn't sound like that instrument anymore. So, audition-wise, it's a different animal because you are playing by yourself, but I'd say most of the time, try to play like you're playing in the ensemble. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Good. Other questions so far? Yes, sir.
When and how do you choose what type of jingles you're going to use?
Well, when you're flying and you have only so much weight you can carry, you bring one tambourine and that's what you do. For me, like for an audition, I would probably take this, which is a Black Swamp Chromium 25, which is really, this is like one of their originals, the first year or two that they started making them. So this is a lot lighter than the more recent models, which still sound great, but are a little more tricky to negotiate with some of the techniques I'm going to do. So for me, I like to err on the side of bright jingles, because that kind of gives you more articulation, kind of like what we were talking about. A darker jingle has a great sound, and for me, if I were going to bring another tambourine, it would probably be like a Grover, one of those mixed jingle combination things that I might use for the next excerpt, like Carmen, something a little more ethnic sounding. Make sense?
Yeah.
So, but really, again, personal choice. I'd say for me, personal preference, brighter is better when I'm playing by myself. In the ensemble, it sort of depends on the context. Like you might use kind of like if you're playing triangle, like, you know, you're going to whip out that big 8 or 10 inch Grover. Doesn't have a lot of uses generally except for big, dark, Germanic stuff, or maybe Mahler, you know what I mean? So, color is everything though, and if you have multiple choices and you go to a rehearsal, bring everything there. Especially when you're in school and you have the ability and you don't have to pay for all these instruments, you just have them. So, is that clarifying?
Yeah.
Good question, very good. All right, why don't we do a little Carmen? Okay. All right. Bear with me, I did this yesterday, I think it's a lot slower than I'm used to, so I'll catch this hopefully around the second measure. 3, 2, 1, go. Carmen, I mean, probably the most famous tambourine excerpt. Like, even if you're not an excerpt head and you're not a classical music fan, there's a good chance at some point you've heard this part. And it's very, nothing is really more, I'm about to make up a word, nothing is really more tambourine than Carmen. Like gypsy music, right? Nothing's really more encompassing the sound of the tambourine than that. So, to me, this, to answer, address you, this doesn't really quite make it for this excerpt, in my opinion. I would not use this for a concert necessarily, unless it was something specific that a conductor wanted, a specific type of sound. So I'm more likely to use like some of the tambourines I bought from different places around the world with like the funky jingles, and I forget all the different names that they have for tambourines, but something a little more interesting sounding. A lot of times those things lose clarity because they're thicker and heavier, and they just have like thicker jingles or only one row. So there's all kinds of different things you have to negotiate there. So questions about Carmen? Yes, sir.
At the beginning, when you're kind of doing this up and down motion,
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's actually affecting the volume, or is that purely for visual?
It's
aspects?
partly it's me just getting into it. It probably is affecting the volume. I'm going to show you an example coming up where I actually do use the height of the tambourine to affect the volume. Not so much here, but in the context of the ensemble.
Yeah, sure.
That to me is just kind of to remind myself that I want to loosen up but don't want to play like a robot, again because of the type of music that it is. Bizet and all these guys really, I mean, except maybe Mahler, most composers tend to underwrite instructions for percussion, which is a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing in as much as that you sort of have to use your own creativity and kind of make up things like accents and dynamics that may not be there in the part. And I think, to tell you the truth, that's what every instrument does to some extent. You know, you're at an advantage where when you play really almost any percussion instrument, but auxiliary in particular, I think, every time you do something, it's a solo. Like, you're usually the only one making that sound. So you kind of have some liberty. It's not like you're playing 12th stand violin, where you're just trying to keep up with the 22 people in front of you. You know, it's a very different animal in that regard. So, point being, I like to bring a lot of character and a Gogic feel, especially to something like this. So me moving around like that is partially habit, partially it's just a reminder that I need to make sure I'm getting into the music. So you'll notice there was a lot of Bizet didn't write it, but the music sort of implies that you need to add some character like that. You also may have noticed at the third line of the excerpt, where it's kind of double piano, I kind of follow the clarinet flute line up and then down again. Again, Bizet didn't write a crescendo, and the flutes aren't necessarily doing it either, but contextually they're getting higher and higher and then lower and lower. And I kind of tend to think when you go higher, it's nice to crescendo a little bit. When you go lower, take crescendo. Not exclusively, but in that excerpt I think it works pretty well. So, yeah, to tell you the truth, that tempo is a lot slower than the recording I normally play with, and that one, to be honest with you, even though it's more difficult, I would certainly just did this opera a couple of years ago, and I did the entire thing up in the air. It's trickier. You got to really get your technique down. But also, I think big thing to point out there is using for the decrescendo going into the into the second line, because that of course is up in the air. I'm using the fact that a more vertical tambourine gives you a wetter sound of the jingles. I mean, you can even just hear it. And as I get, you know how much it dries up and the texture changes. I sort of gradually go from this position to that position as I'm playing the decrescendo. You may have seen that. Hopefully you heard it as well. So, good. Other questions? Great. I could talk about tambourine all day, but I'm not going to. All right, why don't we do the next one? You have that queued up?
Yep.
All right. This one really is not that much new to talk about, except it brings up the triplet thing that you were talking about in Carnival. So this one's mostly for me because I just like playing it. So, let's do it. Again, Spanish music, there's a lot of style and groove to it. I don't think anyone's ever going to hear it's got you got to really feel and become part of the music while you're playing it. It sounds cornball as hell when I say it like that, but when you're playing it and you feel it in here, it really makes a difference. So, let me mention something also about the knee fist technique. That's sort of the generic concept for that, using your knee and in some part of your hand. I almost never actually use my fist to play tambourine. I think I use it in the last two notes of Carnival because that's a really loud pop. By and large, I don't really have a spot on my knee that's going to recreate this. I have a pretty bony knee, and if you find that spot, for me, I use what I like to call the striking cobra, which is just this. By the way, while we're doing this, is someone taking some photos? Was I asking you about that? Yeah. So feel free at any time, and that's true for all of you guys. I don't have your phones out texting and stuff, but I forgot to bring my camera, and my guys that helped me out need some pictures from this. So anyway, I think you'll find, again, every individual's a little different, but for me to do this, it's just a little too powerful and it's a little too rock and roll sounding. It can be very aggressive and sometimes ugly, especially when you're playing by yourself. So I use sort of just bringing all the fingers into a point, and then I find that spot on my knee that kind of feels similar. And the idea is you're basically doing this with a tambourine in the way. So it's not playing out here and then hitting on your knee here. The idea is that where you strike on this side is where you strike on the other side. Make sense? Good. It's a fairly simple technique that you actually hear done pretty badly, quite frequently. A lot of times I think that's also because one of the few times, had you been a student of mine, you would never ever hear me say tension is good. About the only time I ever say that is when I'm holding the tambourine for knee fist technique. And is that my sort of fulcrum point kind of moves up to my elbow, and that it's very much a very army stroke, that your tambourine isn't doing this. Because if you listen, as opposed to where I'm keeping it a little more rigid, the tambourine isn't wobbling this way because then the jingles kind of get in the way.